grab your drink, your sandwich, your cookies.
More food is on the way.
And more food is on the way.
More food is on the way.
Okay, thank you all so much. We appreciate your presence. Good crowd. Welcome to the Chase family. Who's part of the Chase family? Raise your hands. Whoa, good crowd. Thank you guys. I want to, and she hates when I do this, Christy Kars-Coleman, our executive director. And Rick Cronin, of course, our author tonight. You've heard of his books, you've heard of some of his events here. Tonight he's going to be telling us some very special things about the actual founding of places that we all know and love, the backstory, things, the names of the people that you never hear about. You hear about this guy, that family, this family. This is going to be extra background and very interesting historical information. So thank you all so much. Richard, it's good to see you again.
Jim, thank you so very much.
Start your end.
All right. Hope you all can hear me. And wow, what an honor it is to be here talking with so many descendants of Benjamin Whitmer. A fascinating individual. I'll tell you a little bit about myself. I was a contractor here in Central Florida right up until about 2009 when I finally retired to get out of the rat race. And decided I wanted to do some writing. I had always wanted to do a little bit of writing, so I decided I wanted to write a fiction book about the 19th century. But I needed to do a little research, so I started doing a little research into it. It turned out that I really got quite fascinated in the story of Central Florida, so much so that I never wrote the fiction. I ended up writing history books. So since 2013, I have published 15 books on various topics of Central Florida history. It's a subject that is very fascinating to me, mainly because of the actual history of this area. Ended up that a lot of history was lost. You see, the Central Florida area, they got started and then they got interrupted. They got interrupted by yellow fever. And then they restarted, and then they got interrupted by a great freeze that took the wealth of many, many individuals. And so those people, a lot of people left. And then they started to come back, and then they started getting freezes again. So there was always interruptions in the story of Central Florida. But there were always new people coming here. But when the new people came here, they didn't always remember the old people. When I was started, for example, doing some of my research, and I read a book called in 1927 that was written on Orange County history by a fellow by the name of William Blackman, a president of Rollins College. And one of the sections I was reading, he says, two individuals from Orange County went to Tallahassee and voted no against Florida secession. And one of them was William W. Woodruff. And he went on to explain William W. Woodruff and the role he played in Orange County. And then he went on to another subject. And I said, well, that's odd. What about the second guy? Well, see, as it turned out, that second guy was written out of Orange County history. I love going out to meetings and presentations where I meet actual descendants of individuals. Tomorrow, my wife Debbie and I, sitting right over here, we're heading to Sanibel, and I'm giving a talk on next Tuesday in Sanibel on that other family. And descendants of that family are flying in from around the country to attend it. So I think it's really cool because when I can actually talk to people about individuals they don't necessarily know about, it just adds that much more fascination to what I do. One of the early individuals that I really started admiring was Benjamin Franklin Whitmer Jr., who was actually the second. I refer to him as Junior because when he really got started in this area, his father was still alive. And so he did a lot of surveying. When I say surveying, I'd like to referring to this map. This is a 1879 map of Orange County. When I say 1879, a lot of this area here is now Seminole County, and parts of this is Lake County. But in 1879, and part of it is also Osceola County. But part of it was surveyed by a gentleman by the name of Benjamin F. Whitmer Jr. From this red line here south is all the land, and you have to take this little section here and put it down here on Lake Tohoplaka. All that land was surveyed by Benjamin Franklin Whitmer Jr., who is Franklin Whitmer II. When I say surveying, take all these lines. These are all 1 square mile lines. Take them all off of this map. And imagine Benjamin Franklin Whitmer Jr. getting off the boat here at Mellonville, because Sanford didn't exist yet. And he followed a military trail all the way down here, 25 miles, well, 22 miles. And that's where he started doing survey work. And every one of these squares down here, you see, was surveyed by this gentleman here. But I really need to start back a ways. So let's start in 1795. At that particular time, a very young United States of America had a dispute with Spain. That dispute was, where was the border? Because they thought they knew where the border was, but they needed to resolve that question. So Andrew Ellicott, who was a friend of Thomas Jefferson, was sent down to determine where was the border between the United States of America, the southern part of Georgia, and the Florida territory, which belonged to Spain. So what he did was not an easy task. You see, he came over to the St. Mary's River and he set a stone. And he said, he figured out where the stone was, or the stone indicated where the southern border was. But the Indians would not allow him to cross over to where he needed to go. So what he did at that time is he got on his ship and he went all the way around to Florida to the St. Marks River, went up the St. Marks River, and he placed a stone. Ellicott's stone. So he had a mound on one area and a stone on another area. By that was 1799. This is an old picture. I'm not sure whether the cage with the stone that he set is still there, but that was 1799. Now let's fast forward to 1854. In 1854, the United States of America, the state of Georgia, had a problem with the state of Florida because they argued over where was the border. Everybody said maybe Ellicott's work was not right. Maybe the border was someplace different. So at that time, Governor James Broome decided, I've had enough of this. I'm going to get 2 people to figure out where the exact state of Florida and Georgia border was. Those 2 people were Benjamin Franklin Whitmer Sr. and Benjamin Franklin Whitmer Jr. Benjamin I and Benjamin II. They represented the state of Florida. And with their help, they met with folks from Georgia, and they recalculated, and they found out that Ellicott's work was pretty accurate. It varied very little. So that gives you some indication of where the Whitmers stood in the state of Florida as far early as the 1854. Both were rather prominent individuals to have been selected to figure out where that border between Florida and Georgia really existed. This is the ancestry of Benjamin Franklin Whitmer. We have to start out with a gentleman by the name of John Joseph Whitmer, who spelled his name a little bit different. And excuse me, there's a few I found this afternoon when I was going through here. I made a few errors in spelling, but let's overlook that. John Joseph Whitmer came to America, and with him he brought a young boy by the name of Joseph Whitmer. John, the father, died in 1764 when his son was only 8 years old. so too did his brother. So that the patriot Joseph Whitner was 7 years old alone in America. No family whatsoever. His son was Benjamin Franklin I, the person I was just talking about that represented the border dispute. His son was Benjamin Franklin II of Madison and Fort Reed and Fort Gatlin here in Orange County. Their son was Benjamin Franklin III of Madison and Sanford. Then we come to Benjamin Franklin F. Whitner, the fourth of Sanford, and Benjamin F. Whitner, the fifth of Sanford. And I believe there might have been another sixth, but I haven't gone that far into that particular family. So here's a little recap again. The immigrant John Joseph Whitner came to America in 1864 and died within several months. His son, alone in America at the age of 7, at the age of 18, he enlisted in the American Revolution. His record with the American Revolution states that as a commander, he never sent his men into danger. He led them. So that's a big thing, especially this year of America 250, is a lot of people wonder, do they have patriots? Benjamin, the Whitner family, it definitely has a patriot. In 1789, he married Elizabeth Shackelford. So here's a little bit about Benjamin Franklin I. He was born in Anderson County, South Carolina, and he married Elizabeth Spann, and she is of the DAR, Daughters of the American Revolution, as well, because she has ancestry, patriot ancestry. In 1819, they had the birth of the son of Benjamin II, the surveyor, and in 1825, they had settled in Hamburg, South Carolina. Sorry, I heard the food was coming, so I guess that was on my mind. And then in 1830, he brought his family to Madison. When he was in Hamburg, he actually started out, I guess I should say, as an attorney when he was in South Carolina, in Anderson County. And he ended up going to Hamburg where he actually started a steamboat venture. That venture didn't go real well because Hamburg was right across the river from Augusta. And Augusta and Hamburg were basically applying for the same individuals, same residents, same business. And as it turned out, Augusta was much more of interest to people. So Hamburg just didn't really and take off so well. So he comes to Madison in 1830. Bad timing on his part, because that was just right before the Seminole Indian War. The house in Madison was burned by an Indian attack. An interesting thing, though, is that the individuals that came down at that time, there is a Hamburg, Florida, which is just a short distance from Madison, same county. So they brought that tradition down of what they had left behind. So anyway, Benjamin Franklin I, he's in 1830 with his family in Madison in no house. So at that particular time, he relocated again and went to the Tallahassee area. So then, by 1835, as I said, the Indians burned his house. So he goes to Lake Jackson in 1840, where he builds Casa del Lago, which is the family home. There was a lot written about how great Casa del Lago was by a biography of Benjamin Franklin Whitmer II's brother, John. But his next door neighbor was James E. Broome. Broome and Whitner came to Florida together. If you remember, Governor Broome made the two Whitners part of their survey resolving the border. And there's a lot more interest in Broome I'll get to. But in 1853, when Governor-elect Broome was waiting to become governor, back then, from the date of election to the date of office was 1 year. So they won 1 year, and then they had to wait a year before they took up that office. But he was out on the circuit, and he said, soon there will be a railroad from St. John's River to Tampa. Now, Tampa was a very, very small port at that time. Couple hundred, probably not even a couple hundred people, but those couple hundred people got very excited to hear that they were going to get a railroad. It's interesting, the location, talking about St. John's River, and I'll get into that shortly, but keep in mind that as early as 1853, there was talk of building a railroad similar to what became in 1880 the South Florida Railroad. All right, I'm going to go into a little what I call the mystery. So let's start out the mystery of Orlando. In 1831, John James Audubon, the artist, came to Florida in search of new specimens. The interesting thing about John James Audubon was he kept a detailed diary of what he did, and he also drew maps of what he did. There were not a whole lot of accurate maps in 1830, so it was quite a good find for historians to refer to. In his diary, he said that he spent Christmas Day at the Bulow Plantation, which is a ruins, which is a state park today. But then he said after that, he went down to St. John's River and visited Spring Garden. This is in his diary. He visited Spring Garden, the plantation of Orlando Reese. A very interesting quote, because the Volusia County historians for the longest time said that Orlando, Florida was named for Orlando Reese. But if you walk around Lake Eola, you see a rock that I hate, that I wish they would remove, that they won't, that says that Orlando, Florida was named for Orlando Reese, a soldier who was killed by Indians in Lake Eola. But there was no such individual. What historians back then didn't realize was the Army kept very detailed records about people that were wounded and killed. And there is no Orlando Reese. Interestingly enough, it's very, very similar to Orlando Reese. But let's go a step further. In Statesburg, South Carolina, my wife, I took Debbie along, and I said, we're going to do some really interesting things, so I took her to a cemetery in Statesburg. She's a great lady. She puts up with my stuff like this all the time. And in Statesburg is the grave of Orlando S. Reese. He was an interesting individual. He had a plantation in Statesburg. He did very, very well up there, and yet he ended up owning Spring Garden. So here is part one of the mystery of Orlando. Spring Garden, the plantation of William Williams the Elder. We know that William Williams originally owned Spring Garden because the Florida records, the land records of the Spanish land grant, says that William Williams the Elder has 22,020 acres, and it's called Spring Garden. So it's no dispute there. Oddly enough, in Sumter County, South Carolina, which is not far from Orlando Reese, his mother, Mary Reese, ended up writing in her will that she bequeathed her property to Orlando S. Reese and James G. Spann. In 1831, as I said, John James Audubon visited Spring Garden, and at that time it was occupied by Colonel Orlando Reese. And in 1831, Benjamin Whitner and his wife Eliza Spann came to Florida and settled in Madison County. So we go to part two. The intriguing mystery of Orlando, Florida, as it relates to the Whitner family. In 1843, Benjamin Franklin Whitner arrived in Central Florida to survey 600 acres, 600 square miles. As I said, he came down the St. Johns River by vessel to Lake Monroe, and from there he and his two chainmen traveled all the way down the Fort Mellon to Fort Gatlin Trail to begin their survey. If you know where ORMC is in Orlando, which is right on Orange Avenue at Miller Street, you could stand at the corner of Orange Avenue and Miller Street, and that is the exact spot of Township 23 where Benjamin Whitner began his survey, and he went south all the way to Kissimmee. What do I mean by him surveying? The surveyors covered every square mile, straight lines. In the 1840s now, they went into straight lines doing their survey work off of the stars, longitude, latitude. They went through a few hammocks. We have a few here in Florida. They crossed a few lakes and they used the machetes to clear. They had to shoot a straight line. And so these people traveled day after day through absolute total wilderness. There was nothing here. There was no 7-Eleven where they could stop and get a slushie for lunch. They were totally on their own. And so to me, they were some of the most admirable individuals to imagine that they traveled all through this land surveying, laying down stakes, and figuring out square mile after square mile after square mile. 600 square miles is what Benjamin Whitner did. Not only did he do this in Orange County, but he extended all the way over into what was then Sumter County. Of course, at that time, they were neither county. It was Mosquito County. So in 1848, Benjamin bought 148 acres here. Now, Florida had only been a state for 3 years then. Here's where he bought his property. If you look at Fort Gatlin, his land was partly surrounded Fort Gatlin. What was Fort Gatlin? Okay, so in Orlando Reese's Spring Valley, or Spring Garden, and 15 other plantations were burned to the ground in 1835. Christmas Day, the Indians attacked and burned them down. At that particular time, the United States Army had also suffered another loss over in Dade County of 100 and some soldiers. So the United States had little to do but declare war on the Indians, so the troops had to come down and clear the area. So when they came down, they settled first at Fort Mellon on Lake Monroe. They called it Camp Mellon, or Camp Monroe, until Captain Mellon was killed in February of 1837. Then they renamed it Camp Mellon. Fort Mellon. So at that time, they waited, and in 1838, they got orders to travel 25 miles inland towards Lake Tohopalaca. And so the Army did, and so that's how the trail got started down to Fort Gatlin. That was the trail that years later in 1843, Benjamin followed to get down to where he started the survey work. I thought it was curious that when he got off the boat, he didn't start surveying. Seemed a little odd. He didn't even go a couple miles and start surveying. None of this area up here was surveyed yet. None of it. It was just a path that went 25 miles, something like that, to the fort. Why did he go all that distance to start surveying? The reason is unknown. I really suspect, that Benjamin Whitner was here because he and his father were looking for a route for a railroad to build to Tampa. And that the best place, he knew what Lake Monroe was like, but he needed to know what the Southern Territory was like for that railroad to go. And so that's why he ended up surveying all the way to Kissimmee. Is that true? I don't know. That's pure speculation on my part. So don't take it to the bank, please. In 1852, as I said, Orlando Reese died. In 1854, Eliza Spann Whitner, the daughter of James Spann and the mother of Benjamin Whitmer II, the man who had done the surveying here, she died in Leon County. And then in 1856, out of the clear blue, in the wilderness along this same very trail, the village of Orlando was established. Did Ben have anything to do with naming it? I suspect he did, but it's one of those mysteries that we may never, ever know. A lot of the information, and this is a real quick, are we doing all right? Do we need any intermission here yet, Jim? A real quick little ad, if you don't mind. My Orlando book covers a lot of what I'm talking about now. Although it deals with the founding of Orlando, it covers all of the intricacies that went from a wilderness to when this was all an Indian reservation up until the time about 1909. And if you want a copy, you can buy a copy of it here from Jim, and part of the proceeds tonight go to help the Winter Garden Heritage Foundation. So, in 1854, as I said at the outset, Governor Broome sets up this commission to resolve Florida-Georgia border. And that commission is made up of a father and son team. The father, who had, as I said, had moved from Madison to Tallahassee, the father, Benjamin I, became very involved in banking and railroading in early Tallahassee, Florida. His son got his interest in railroads honestly. Benjamin II, born in South Carolina, married a lady by the name of Sarah Jane Church. And by 1840, they had settled on the homestead of their father at Madison that was burned, rebuilt, and so he started his family at Madison. In 1843 is when he came to Orange County, but he did not relocate his family. Family stayed in Madison. He came down here because there was nothing here for the family as far as lodging or anything. So he came down here to do the survey work. In 1843 and 1844, he surveyed Fort Gatlin. From this red line, as I said, down. Fort Gatlin, it was just about 5 miles south of where he started surveying. His survey actually showed Fort Gatlin. So we know exactly where Fort Gatlin was and the size of it because of Ben's surveys, which I'll show you shortly here. When he came here, there had been a change in the presidency. And with the change in the presidency, a new Florida surveyor had been assigned. And that surveyor name was Conrad Valentine Conway. So when Ben was doing his survey, the first lake he named was Lake Conway for the Florida surveyor. 4 years later, Ben was still here surveying. By that time, he was over in the area of Lake Butler. And by that time, the presidency had changed back again. And so the old surveyor, who had been Robert Butler, came back into as being the Florida General Surveyor. And so Benjamin named Lake Butler for him. So two of the very large lakes, Conway and Butler, were named by Whitner for his bosses at different times while he was down here. And then, as I said, he started buying land around Lake Gatlin. I suspect he also named Lake Gatlin because as early as 1870, he issued a deed calling it Lake Gatlin, but I can't say for sure that he named it, but I assume that he did. In 1843, as I said, when he came to here to start his survey work, he was the very first non-military settler or individual pioneer to come to Central Florida. And he walked, as I said, 600 square miles of this area. He even named a lake Sarah Jane over in Lake County, but that has since changed to Sumter Lake up in the villages. So in 1854 comes the talk of the railroad between Lake Monroe and Tampa Bay. This, as I said, really excited the people in Tampa. There was newspaper articles back then about how excited they were that this was going to give Tampa an opportunity to grow. A lot of people at first thought one would think that all these towns along the shoreline, the coastline, were developed because of people coming ashore, but they really weren't. Most of the towns were developed by pioneers who came down Central Florida and moved towards the ocean front. At that time, people weren't coming to the ocean for the beach. They were coming to Central Florida to get away from the cold. But the reasoning didn't necessarily take them to many beaches, not until the railroad started operating. The problem was that while they were trying to get this train to run from Lake Monroe to Tampa Bay, a guy by the name of David Yulee, who was the senator at that time, and the son of Moses Levy, he changed his name, who was developing a lot of Spanish land grant land in Florida, he decided he was going to build a railroad from Fernandina to Cedar Key, and did, right before the Civil War. So by accomplishing that, it really shelved the plans for the train to go from Lake Monroe to Tampa. Why Lake Monroe to Tampa? Well, keep in mind that the way travelers came into Florida was to travel by boat from Jacksonville down the St. Johns River to Lake Monroe. That was the way people made it inland. And so if they came down by steamboat to Lake Monroe, they could then get on a train and go to Tampa. And in Tampa, all these people that were growing or raising cattle in between could take their cattle to Tampa and ship it to Cuba, which was a huge market. So it was very lucrative idea to have the train run from Lake Monroe to Tampa. But Yulee's Sea to Sea Railroad, Fernandina to Cedar Key, started any construction of the railroad and almost eliminated the idea of having a train that Whitner was involved in. So that was completed around 1859. And then that came on the shoulders of the Civil War. When the Civil War broke out, everything changed. Benjamin Whitner sent two sons off to Civil War. Alonzo Church Whitner, 1841, he was born, and he joined the Florida 2nd Cavalry. Benjamin Franklin Whitmer III was born in 1842, and he unfortunately joined Florida 1st Infantry. Florida's infantry suffered more losses of Florida boys and casualties than any of the others, and he was actually wounded at Chancellorsville, Virginia. Survived fortunately, so that we ended up having a Benjamin Franklin Whitmer IV. But the Civil War naturally left a very bad taste in the mouths of Southerners and Northerners. It really divided our country and tore us apart. And everything that was planned for Florida came to a screeching halt until after the war. Are we doing all right, or do we need to? Yeah. Couple minutes? Okay. Oh, I went backwards, didn't I? See, I was trying to feed you and I got distracted. Another book that I have here that is my brand new book, and I don't want to take 1 second or two to promote, because Colonel Whitmer is in this also, is Historic Florida Towns and Places. This is an encyclopedia book. It's 625 towns. 1,700 pioneers are in the index, and their towns are in alphabetic order. It gives a little history about them, the date they were established, who established them, many of them are why they're named what they're named. One of the first things I have to caution you is, okay, I'll stop right after this 1 second. One of the things I will caution you is when I have my date of establishment, very rarely agrees with the date of establishment that towns say they were established. And the reason is this: most towns decide that they are established when they got incorporated. Orlando's a perfect example. Orlando insists it was founded in 1875, but it was not. It was founded in 1857. So to say that it was established in 1875 means that you lose 18 years of the earliest pioneer history, which is not fair to those people. So my encyclopedia gives the date that the area was actually established as a settlement. In that example is Davenport. Thanks to Benjamin Whitmer doing his survey work, where if you know where Champions Gate is, where 429 exits onto I-4, that right there is part of Reedy Creek. And it was right there that Fort Davenport existed, right on the creek. We only know that today because Benjamin Franklin Whitmer II surveyed it and showed us exactly where it was. And with that, I think we're going to take a short break so that y'all can get some food.
We have some food. Just want to say, and you mentioned Davenport, they actually have a walking tour on a brochure. A friend and I went down to Davenport, got the map, and did the walking tour. Everything we said, every block or so was, how about that? This used to be here, and that used to be there, and this used to be there. But there are a lot of buildings still standing. I'm glad you mentioned Davenport.
Okay.
I think it's out to that part of the county. It's a good walking tour of all Florida citrus history. Thank you, Richard.
Okay.
We'll get y'all go to the back, get a fresh drink, some food, and we'll continue in a little bit.
All right.
Thank you.
Sure thing.
Okay, I think we're ready. Everyone's refilled and replated. They're saying the restaurant. Okay, we're going to get started again in about 2 minutes, so you grab your seats. Thank you all so much.
I'm anxious to tell you about the most honorable thing about Benjamin Franklin Whitmer. So whenever you take a seat here, you get started. So along comes the Civil War. And of course the Florida Northern Panhandle is pretty much wiped out. So because the Florida Panhandle is pretty much no longer a place to live and earn a living, Benjamin Franklin Whitmer decides he's going to bring his family to Orange County. One of the most fascinating things to me about Benjamin Franklin Whitmer is what happened after the Civil War. You have to imagine that Central Florida, you have to take into consideration, Central Florida lost 1/3 of its young men. Before the Civil War, there was only about 300 young men to begin with. 100 of them were killed or never came back from the Civil War. It was destitute here. An early visitor came in 1867, got off the boat right there at Melonville, and said it was the most depressing place he had ever seen. The people were destitute. They just didn't even hardly want to live. He just couldn't imagine how distraught they were. And this is where Benjamin Franklin Whitmer decided to move his family. But he didn't come here immediately. In 1867, on the 19th of December 1867, a gentleman by the name of Moses Lyman, who lived in Connecticut, had an announcement in the newspaper that he was leaving to go tour the South. He was going to go tour the southern states. This man was very wealthy. He was involved in the railroad industry. And so he decided to come south. Now in 1867, the war was over, but the Reconstruction period was underway. So Florida was occupied. Melonville was occupied. Navy U-boats were still going up and down the St. Johns River. The provost marshal was still in Jacksonville, and he had control over everything that went on in Orange County. But Moses Lyman appeared in the newspaper again a short time later. It said that Moses Lyman has safely arrived at Madison, Florida. Moses Lyman, a railroad tycoon from Connecticut, came to Madison, Florida, where Benjamin Franklin Whitmer II lived. The two joined forces. To me, this is something that anybody who is related in any way, fashion to this man should be so terribly proud of. Because a Southerner and a Northerner reached out to make peace. And how did they make peace? Well, they came to Orange County. They found a piece of property that was called the Mundy property. It had been owned by a Virginian young fella who came down here and acquired 160 acres as a homestead before the Civil War. He went to war and never came home. So the two, Lyman and Whitmer, came down and made this deal that if Whitmer could get a hold of the property, Lyman and he would join forces and and they would split the 80 acres apiece and go into business in the citrus industry. That was major. In a war-torn South, I can't stress enough what it meant that these two made this partnership. This is now south near Fort Reed. History totally lost focus of this. Sanford history talks about this particular piece of property being established by L. Phelps. Well, it was Lyman Phelps. He was a descendant of Mr. Moses Lyman. So this was originally Moses Lyman's property, and this would be Whitmer's right on the railroad. The two were, Whitmer went to Virginia, made a deal with the family, and bought Mundy Place, and then came back, and Lyman ended up going into partnerships with them. In 1868, the following year, John A. McDonald wrote in a book, Plain Talk About Florida. McDonald became very interested in developing the Eustis area. But he wrote this book because he first came ashore at Lake Monroe in Melville. And he actually wrote about this. He said, my hopes were buoyed up in 1868 when Colonel B.F. Whitmer, an old North Florida, decided to leave North Florida and come to Orange County, and he secured a Yankee to provide the capital, all $650. So he actually found a partner that took care of the $650 for him. But they actually ended up growing. He said the place is now the finest in Florida. A part of the grove sold 5 or 6 years ago for a large sum, nearly $20,000. And the whole grove laid out and managed for several years by Colonel Whitmer now belongs to several owners and could not be bought for $100,000. Benjamin Whitmer decided that he was going to settle in Fort Reed, up here at the top of the trail. The Fort Bell Fort Gatlin trail went right through Fort Reed being a supply depot back in the war years. So Whitmer didn't necessarily want him to have that partnership, though. Whitmer wanted him to go into partnerships with his land at Fort Gatlin. How do we know that? It's because they actually wrote about it. So what happened was this. Lyman didn't want to go 20-some miles down and have to ship everything all the way up a dirt trail. There was no railroad yet, remember? 1867, the railroad hadn't even begun yet. And so what happened was, Lyman said, no, I want to stay closer to Lake Monroe, where we can ship our product very easily. So Whitmer said, all right, what else can I do? So this is Lake Gatlin, down here at the other end of the trail. The Fort Bell and the Fort Gatlin Trail, the spine of Central Florida. All of Central Florida, Winter Garden, all of it has developed out from this spine. The spine that was supposed to go from Lake Monroe all the way to Tampa, and eventually did. But John C. McGehee, and I know I'm throwing out a lot of names, but if I get too lost, just raise your hand and say, what did you say? John C. McGehee was a northern planter who bought land through a Homestead Act on Fort Gatlin right next to Benjamin Whitmer before the Civil War. When the war ended, he left the country. Found out he could come back because they gave him amnesty. And so he decided he was going to stay up in the Panhandle, up around Hamburg and Madison. So McGehee wanted to unload his land that was down next to Benjamin Whitmer's. So Benjamin Whitmer made a deal with a guy by the name of William M. Randolph, an attorney from New Orleans. He knew Randolph because Randolph used to be at Tallahassee. Randolph was very closely related to the Thomas Jefferson family. They quite intricately connected. So Randolph buys McGehee's property, and Whitmer was involved. How do I know it? Because the witness to the deed was Alonzo Whitmer, Whitmer's son. So now Whitmer has a financial backer for Fort Reed. He's got a business financial investor up here in Fort Reed, and he's got one down at the end of the trail from New Orleans. Randolph brought his brother-in-law, Preston. His name was Oshiti Pushpahaha Preston or something like that. He had this area over here was his 160 acres. Randolph owned this area. This square here, this little square here, that is Fort Gatlin. So the entrance to Fort Gatlin crossed over Randolph's property. William Randolph, his daughter married Will Wallace Harney, pioneer, the individual who settled right at Pine Castle, and he's considered Mr. Pine Castle to this day. So Benjamin owned this land around Lake Whitmer. Randolph owned that. Francis Epps, the grandson of Thomas Jefferson, through the help of William Randolph, was just north of here on Lake Pine Lock. now we have the makings of a development, a long development, two different areas, in a land where people were not settling at all. The Civil War was just over, and so you can easily say that Benjamin Franklin Whitmer II had a whole lot to do with turning Central Florida from a place of destitute to a place of settlement. This is Benjamin Franklin Whitmer's survey of just Fort Gatlin. And there's the fort. I highlighted it, but he actually had drawn it up. It was at an overlook of 3 lakes. And in 1874, Will Wallace Harney, who was the son-in-law of William Randolph, wrote, "Colonel Whitmer last week surveyed his tract on Lake Conway, laying it off in 5-acre lots for a party of immigrants." This was 1874. Orlando didn't exist yet. Or, I'm sorry, Orlando did not exist as a incorporated town yet. It was a 4-acre village that only had 2 shops and a raggedy courthouse. But you passed through Orlando on the way to Fort Gatlin. So Will Wallace Harney in 1875, a year later, writes this. And Will Wallace Harney, he used to be a correspondent to the Cincinnati Commercial, so all of his articles appeared in newspapers up north. But he wrote, "Among those to whom this county owes its first start are Colonel Whitmer of Mellonville, Honorable W.M. Randolph of Louisiana, who Whitmer brought to the area, Honorable Francis Epps, formerly the grandson of Thomas Epps, who came because of William Randolph. And these were the pioneers of the settlement." You can't deny Whitmer was right there as far as establishing Central Florida. Now, the town of Orlando, the village of Orlando, was 4 acres in 1875 when they decided to incorporate the town. And that's how Orlando will tell you now that it was established in 1875. And they enlarged it to 1 square mile. So Orlando's in business in 1875. In 1879, the mayor of Orlando dissolves the city. Says that he's locking up all the records because it appears that maybe the incorporation was not legitimate. So the owner, one of the owners, 2 people owned it, and that was the real problem. A guy by the name of William A. Patrick owned it, and a guy by the name of William R. Reed owned it. And the reason went back to, as I said at the outset, history got very diluted in this area. It was very hard to say who did what, but Robert R. Reed of Palatka, he believed he owned all 120 acres, and he believed that William Patrick was not a legitimate owner. But in 1879, they finally were going to talk about building a railroad from Lake Monroe to Orlando, a railroad that they wanted to eventually extend to Tampa. But the railroad said, we're not coming to Orlando because you guys can't even decide who is going to give us a legitimate deed. So unless you can get things straightened out, we're not going to have our track come to Orlando. We're going to go around Orlando. So by 1879, they started trying to figure out a way to solve it. Reed really led the deal. He hired attorneys to get things worked out. But one of the first things he had to do was get the county commissioners to agree that the 4 acres, the old village of 4 acres, was their property, and satisfy them that he's giving them exclusive right. And at that particular time, one of the Orange County commissioners was Benjamin Franklin Whitmer. In 1881, the South Florida Railroad decided to get extended. It arrived in Orlando after resolving all the dispute with the county commissioner and the other property owners, it arrived in Orlando in November of 1880, after many decades of trying to build it. Benjamin Whitmer sat in one of the very first meetings in 1870, 10 years earlier, trying to work out this deal. Finally, the train came in 1880. The next year, in 1881, the train was extended to Pine Castle. And a station was built at Gatlin, which was, at that particular point in time, known as Whitmer's Point. Unfortunately, Benjamin Franklin Whitmer II died in April of 1881. So I suspect he knew the railroad, that he had longed to work on trying to bring to Central Florida. He knew it was coming, but he didn't actually see the first train cross over his property, but it did. It actually, it travels away. The railroad track is still there today, traveling right down through where Gatlin Station used to be. So, if you like hearing any of this, and you say, you know somebody who didn't make it, I am going to do an encore of this presentation in Pine Castle Pioneer Days. I had the distinct pleasure of doing, I do a history tent during Pioneer Days, and it's a 2-day event in Pine Castle. This year we're celebrating America's 250th anniversary naturally. And I line up speakers every hour, top of every hour we have speakers and so forth. And back in 2022, I had the pleasure of doing a talk, and this gentleman right over here came to it. And along with him, Dean Berrien, who came from Tallahassee. And Dean, if you ever want to know anything about the Whitmers, and you can't find that Frank says, I don't know about it, call Dean, because Dean has everything imaginable on that individual. He brought, well, both of them brought big books to the tent. But I really got to start on it. Benjamin Whitmer is one individual, as I said, that I have really found a fascinating early pioneer since I first started doing my research. As I said, I do have 2 books here. Part of the proceeds goes to the benefit of this museum. I'm trying to do everything I can to help keep the museums alive. If you're not a member, then I suggest that you join. This is a great organization. I first came to it in 2013 when Jim was sitting in this little bitty cubbyhole over behind the railroad depot, and I heard all their big plans, and I said, yeah, right. You don't know much about museums. They can't even keep their doors open these days, and look what they did. This is a great, great organization, and thank you all very much.
Any questions from anybody?
I know you guys you got names floating through your head. You're saying, I don't know what that guy said. But any questions?
Where's Spring Gardens?
I'm sorry, what?
Spring Gardens.
Spring Garden is today the Leon Springs. The old mill. The old mill is supposedly a replica of the mill that was there, and it was designed sort of from the survey of Spring Garden that was done back in the 1830s.
Now I'm feeling for pancakes.
Yes, you can. Pancakes on the grill. Best place in the world to go. If you haven't been there, you gotta go. Boy, that was an easy question. No difficult questions?
Well, so the original Whitmer, John Joseph Whitmer, said he immigrated here from Germany.
Yes.
Was it common for Germans to immigrate to the U.S. at that time? As far as you know?
As far as I know, I mean, they were coming from Germany and Ireland, France.
Okay.
But they weren't coming in huge numbers. And that was right after the American Revolution. The United States was about 20 years old when he came, I believe, 1720.
Well, I think he came before the
No, that's right, he
revolution.
came before, yeah, because his son
His
didn't.
son was in it, yeah.
So, we're talking about, it was colonies.
It was
then.
the
So,
British
I mean,
colony, yeah.
It wasn't huge immigration yet, the real big number. I've tried my best to see if I have any relative that was in the American Revolution. I can't find, all mine were drunk Irishmen that came to the and a few Germans. And I think they were maybe drinkers too, but I don't know. But anyway, I can't find any in my family that came over here that early. Most of the immigration came, I think, after the Revolution. Yes, sir.
So a lot of land that you talk about, some was purchased, and I'm just curious about like the ownership of land, of like how much was homesteaded, like who's in control of land when they were trying to work out these things to, get rights to put a railroad through, and, like, I'm just a little curious about like how the land was owned.
Okay, there were several ways you could get land when you came to Central Florida. One was the Homestead Act. The government had, I think it was 250,000 acres in Central Florida that you could get a homestead for. And you could come, after the surveys were done, you could homestead. I guess one thing I should have pointed out was the surveys is what the homesteads were based upon. So a square mile is 640 acres. And so when Aaron Jernigan came down here in 1843, the only place he could homestead was south of that red line there, because Benjamin Franklin Whitmer, he was the only surveyor at that time who had completed any surveys. So Lake Catherine, where Aaron Jernigan homesteaded, he got 160 acres. So Benjamin says, okay, I've got this Township 23 South. Let me back up. If you look at your township, it's a township and a range. Here it's Township 22 South, 27 East. If you took Lot 1, at the very first section, at that point where it all started, that means that if you took, every township is 6 miles by 6 miles. So if you took 22 South, 22 times 6, and 27 East, 27 times 6, you would go exactly right back to the point 0 in Tallahassee. That's where the Tallahassee Meridian. That was the amazing thing to me of what our surveyors did. When they came here, they were dealing 27 times 6 and 27 times 6 south, 22 times 6 south, 27 times 6 east of Tallahassee's point 0. And there was a marker there. And that's how they did it. So when you look at this map, the heavy lines, there was 19 south, 20, 21, 22. Orlando was in 22 south. Just like this, but it's 29 east because it's 12 miles over. So everything was in 6 by 6 square miles. When the surveyor laid out down here, that's how they did it. They went 6 miles, 6 miles, 6 miles, 6 miles, and made a square, and then they figured out the lakes involved in it. How they did it, I can't explain it because there was nothing here. Absolutely nothing. But, so once they finally got that done, they broke that 6 miles into 36 squares. 6 squares, each square was a mile square. So 6 across, 6 down. 36 squares are in a township. And that's how you end up with section 10, which is where Aaron Jernigan settled. When you go to section 10, he bought the northwest quarter, say, of section 10, and his brother Isaac got the southeast section. So they were in the same area. Am I making any sense at all? They got this 6 mile square, break it down to 1 mile. Because of what Whitmer was doing, Aaron could file a homestead in 1843 because that survey of that area. So now he could get a document that says you own the northwest quarter of section 10 of 22 south, 29 east, or whatever. That's how he wrote it up, and that was federal land. Now, every time a state was formed,
How did they decide what 6 miles was?
Why did they
How
decide?
do you know what a mile is?
Oh,
Back then.
how did they know what a mile was?
Chains.
You mean, how did they determine it?
Well, how did they know, like, how far was a mile?
All based on longitude and latitude
But how they
and
measure.
dealing with the stars. I mean, one day I'm trying to find a surveyor who really knows completely so that he could actually put on a talk. I think he would probably fill a room. How they did it back then is just, to me, they were the most amazing individuals because, remember, there was panther, bears, you name it, was roaming around here. There was nothing except they could actually clear a spot, know that they were doing, with their compass, that they were doing directly south. And they were so accurate. Now, there was a little bit off, but they were so accurate that your property bills today, your property bills are based upon section township range that was laid out in the 1840s.
I came to Pioneer Days a few years back, and I feel like you were saying they carried chains. And
Yes, they used chains.
to measure.
The problem that they did not realize that using that chain, mile after mile after mile after mile, is that the chain started to wear off and get shorter. So that caused a few problems for them, but they still did pretty well off of it. So, now that was one way that you could get from the federal government land. Another way you could do it is you could buy land from the state. You see, when the state was formed, the United States government gave them, each state, so many millions of acres, 25 million acres or something like that, so that those states could sell it. Now that land was usually determined to be swampland. So when you look at Orlando, for example, up around Lake Ivanhoe, you could not get a homestead from the federal government because it was considered, that land was considered swampland. So some of the finest property in the Orlando area was sold by the state. And they got that revenue. And then there was some land given to school districts so that the schools could sell property and get money to build schools. Those were the three basic ways. The fourth way was the one that caused a lot of complications in this area, and that was you could live on a piece of property for 7 years and claim it as yourself, as your property. There was some of that done. Now that was because we were a homestead state, but the legal requirement was you had to file for that property, and people didn't do that. So they lived on it 7 years thinking, okay, this piece of property here is mine, but they didn't legally file claiming it after they lived it 7 years. And so therefore, somebody else would oftentimes ended up with the rent. But those were basically the 4 ways you could get property down here. And they needed settlers desperately. And that's why the settlers, or the surveyors, were so important. Benjamin was a little unusual for a surveyor. Most of the surveyors traveled down through the states. One was Charles Tracy, for example. He did a lot of surveyor work up around where we live, Mount Dora area. Well, when he got finished there, he went to California. Henry Washington was a nephew of George Washington, and he did a lot of surveying here. A lot of the surveyors they traveled around the country where they were needed. Benjamin was a little bit unusual in that he was a Florida resident who lived where he surveyed.
I can't recall if you shared what the result was, the original Benjamin Franklin Whitmer and his son, when they verified the Florida-Georgia
property line.
Did they push it up
They
a little bit?
found that it was very, very accurate. It was off a little bit, but they found that for the most part it was pretty accurate. And they decided that they would go with what Ellicott had determined. Although many years, I think just recently, Georgia and Florida got into a dispute over property again, or where the border was again. Well, I certainly hope you enjoyed this as much as I haven't stopped. Thank you all very, very much. Thank you. Always a pleasure.
want to say, in addition to Richard's books, which are on sale, very incisive, very detailed, and beautiful books about local history, whoever has attended tonight, you can take home one of these for free off the table. So if you don't have a copy, because there's a lot of them out there in Orange County, please take one home. Thank you.
Thanks.
Let me see.